Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. There is a particular quality to a house that knows it is being left. Dorothea Marsh had lived in Ash House for 31 years, had come to it as a bride of 31, and was now leaving it as a widow of 62, and the arithmetic of this symmetry was not lost on her. She had, in fact, spent a considerable portion of the past week noting such symmetries in the margins of the household accounts she was sorting through, because noting them was easier than feeling them, and she had always been better at the former than the latter, or had always believed so, which amounted to the same thing. The October afternoon was coming in through the sitting-room window at the particular low angle it always came at this time of year. Not quite warm, not quite cold, the light of a season settling into itself, and in that light the room looked as it had always looked, and also not at all as it had always looked, because already 3 of the bookshelves were half empty, and the pale squares on the walls where her watercolors had hung were more vivid than the walls surrounding them, as if the pictures had been the structural element and the house merely their frame. She had been sorting books for 2 hours. She was not very good at sorting books. Every other volume seemed to require that she open it and read at least 1 page, and 1 page always became 3, and 3 became the whole afternoon. She had, at last, placed the books into 3 categories: take, leave for the auction, and a 3rd category she had not named, and which contained most of the books, and which she was fairly certain was cannot decide, and will revisit this problem at a later date. Thomas would have sorted the books in 40 minutes. Dorothea took off her reading glasses, polished them on the corner of her shawl, replaced them, and looked at the room. It was time to do the study. The study had always been Thomas's room, and it had remained Thomas's room for the 8 years since his death, which was perhaps not the healthiest arrangement, but it seemed to Dorothea not merely forgivable, but necessary. She had used his desk occasionally. She had sat in his wooden chair when she needed to write a letter that required more formal posture than the sitting room offered, but she had not, in 8 years, moved anything from its position or opened any of the drawers or examined the contents of the trunk that lived in the corner beside the desk under the north-facing window, which admitted a grey and consistent light that Thomas had always said was ideal for close work. The trunk was dark brown leather with brass fittings, and it had belonged to Thomas's father, and before that to Thomas's grandfather, who had been a schoolmaster in Derbyshire, and so the trunk had spent its life in the proximity of paper and ideas, which seemed right. Thomas had kept in it, Dorothea knew in a general way, his own papers, correspondence, receipts, the deeds to the house, along with such personal effects as he considered worth keeping, but not worth displaying. She had told herself she would open it when she was ready. She was not ready, but the trunk would have to go somewhere, and she could not direct it to go somewhere without knowing what it contained. and so the question of readiness was, in a practical sense, beside the point. She knelt on the study floor, carefully because her left knee had opinions about cold floors, and opened the trunk. The deeds were there, the correspondence tied in bundles by decade, a velvet box she recognized as containing a watch that had been Thomas's father's. And beneath all of this, filling the entire bottom third of the trunk, stacked with the methodical neatness that had been one of Thomas's qualities she had most admired, her journals, all of them, 40 years of them, every volume she had ever filled and placed on the study shelf, which she had some time in the years after his death stopped noticing were there. She had forgotten he had moved them to the trunk, or perhaps she had known and filed the knowledge somewhere she did not often visit. She sat back on her heels and looked at them. The earliest was very small, the size of a hymnal, dark green leather, corners rubbed to pale at each point. The most recent was fuller, more confident in its dimensions. Between them, 40 years. The handwriting of a woman of 22, and of 25, and of 30, and of 40, and of 57. All of it hers, none of it. Entirely familiar. She had never reread them. She had written in them and put them away and not looked back, the way you plant bulbs in November and trust the spring without going to dig them up in February to check on their progress. She reached in and lifted the first one. She did not begin reading immediately. She carried the small green journal, the first one, 1848, the year she turned 22, into the sitting room, set it on the round mahogany table beside her chair, and made a cup of tea with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who understands that some things should not be rushed into. The cup she always used, the white one with the small blue cornflowers around the rim, the chip on the handle that had been there since the first winter in this house, when she had dropped it against the range, and it had somehow survived intact, except for that one small defect. She filled with tea and set it beside the journal, and then sat down in her chair and looked at both of them for a moment. The fire she had lit an hour ago had settled into itself now, the particular stage of a coal fire where the coal has gone from its initial theatrical flame to a deeper, more serious heat, orange-red in the interior, grey-white ash accumulating at the base. The room smelled of coal smoke and the dried chrysanthemums in the vase on the mantelpiece. She opened the first journal. The handwriting was hers and was not hers. It was rounder, more effortful, the hand of a woman who had not yet settled into her way of writing, who was still trying on different versions of herself to see which one fit. The ink had faded to a warm brown, the colour of dried bracken. October the 5th, 1848. My name is Dorothea Hartley, and I am 22 years old, and today was my first full day in the schoolroom at Ramsby, and I believe I have made every possible mistake one could make in a single day, with the possible exception of setting the building on fire, which I consider a moral triumph under the circumstances. Dorothea Marsh, née Hartley, 62 years old, read this sentence and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite laughter, but lived in the territory between them. She had forgotten the brackets. She had forgotten that at 22 she had used brackets when she meant to be ironic. Thomas had teased her about it. She had stopped using them sometime in her 30s, she thought, when irony had become less of a literary device and more simply the texture of how she saw things. She turned the page. I had 17 children today. The youngest is 5, and the oldest is 14, and knows more about the construction of slingshots than I know about teaching, which is, I admit, not currently saying very much. But I looked at them, all 17 of them, and I thought, well, here we are then, here we are then. 40 years later, reading herself at 22, Dorothea thought, yes, here we are. She read through the afternoon. The first journal covered only 9 months, October 1848 to July 1849, and the entries were uneven, the way a person is uneven when they are discovering, for the first time, what they need to say and how much space it requires. Some entries were 2 lines. One covered 6 pages and concerned a single Tuesday in February when everything in the schoolroom had gone wrong simultaneously, and Dorothea had sat at her desk after the children left and cried for a quarter of an hour, and then made a list, in her tidy round handwriting, of every specific thing she intended to do differently. She remembered none of this. She did not mean that she had forgotten it. She meant something subtler, that the specific texture of those days, the particular weight of each difficulty and each small victory, had been absorbed over decades into the general fabric of what her life had been, and reading it now felt like pulling a thread and finding it led somewhere specific, to a self she had been before she became herself, a self still making decisions about what she would be. The schoolroom she described in the first journal was the original one, the small stone building on the far side of the market square, before the new school was built in 1865. She could see it now, reading. The low windows that admitted more draught than light, the iron stove in the corner that heated half the room and left the other half to manage as best it could, the particular smell of 20 children in varying states of cleanliness in a small room on a winter morning. I have learned, she wrote in March of 1849, that a child who will not look at you directly is not a child who does not hear you. Sometimes they hear you better with their eyes down. I have been looking at the wrong thing. She sat with this sentence for a while. It was true, had been true, had remained true across 4 decades of teaching children who were and were not ready to be taught. Children who needed different approaches. Children who surprised her. Children she had failed. Children she had helped more than she ever knew. She had learned that particular lesson about averted eyes in her first year, and it had served her for 40. Outside, the light was going. She lit the oil lamp. She put the journal down at 6:30, ate the cold supper she had prepared earlier and did not particularly taste, and then put on her cloak and went out. This was not unusual. She had walked the town every evening for 30 years. Not the same route every evening, but always the town, always on foot, always in the hour after supper. It was, she had written, somewhere in the middle journals, the method by which I ensure that I do not spend my entire life indoors with my own thoughts for company, which would be perfectly pleasant, but not very improving for either the thoughts or for me. Ramsby, in October at dusk, had a particular quality that she had loved all her life and would miss with a specific named grief. The way the market square looked when the last light had gone from the sky, but before the full dark settled, the the stone of the buildings holding a faint warmth. It had gathered during the day, the gas lamps coming on in the shop windows, the smell of coal smoke and the river not far away, and the particular damp stone smell that was simply the smell of this town in autumn, the smell she had been breathing her whole adult life without once thinking. To write it down because some things are so thoroughly present that you cannot see them. She was writing it down now, in her head, at least. She had been composing the missing entries all afternoon, the ones she had not written because she had been too busy living the days to record them. Today, I walked the market square at dusk in October, and the stones were the colour of old honey, and Mr. Hargreaves' baker's shop still had its light on, and the smell was this, exactly this. She walked along Church Street, past the door of Ash House without looking at it. She would be inside it again soon enough. She could afford not to look at it now. Past the church itself, with its square Norman tower, and the yew tree in the south corner of the yard that was older than the church. Past the lane that led down to the river. She stopped at the end of Church Street, where the road opened into the market square, and stood for a moment in the early dark. Here we are then, she thought, echoing her 22-year-old self. Here we are. She turned and walked home. The second journal was thicker than the first. She had grown into her writing by then, understood better what she needed from it, and covered the years 1850 to 1853. She had been 24 when it began, and she had written into it the things she was learning, how to teach a child who had already decided not to learn, how to survive the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from caring deeply about work that the world considers modest, how to live alone in 2 rooms above the linen drapers in a way that felt like a life rather than a waiting room. And, near the back of the second journal, in entries from the autumn of 1852, Thomas. She had been 26 when she met him, and she had described him in her journal with the precision of someone who was trying to be fair and was not entirely succeeding. November the 9th, 1852. A new family has come to the town, Mr. and Mrs. Marsh from Kettering, who have taken the house on Bridge Street. He is a solicitor, and she is the sort of woman who runs the house and the husband with equal efficiency. They have a son, Thomas, who is perhaps 30 and unmarried, and who came this evening to the Educational Committee meeting, which he had absolutely no reason to attend, except curiosity, which is a quality I have always liked in a person. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. He listened to the answers without interrupting. I find this unusual enough to be worth noting. She had not described his appearance at all in the first entry. Dorothea noted now with amusement. She had described his questions. She had always been like that about people, interested first in what they thought, second in how they looked. Thomas had found this both flattering and slightly disconcerting. December the 3rd. He came to the schoolroom today with his mother's subscription to the new library box. Mrs. Marsh Sr. could have sent a servant, but sent Thomas instead, which I take as a form of communication, whose precise meaning I am not yet certain of, but intend to investigate. He stayed for 40 minutes. We discussed whether Dickens or Thackeray was the superior novelist. He preferred Dickens. I preferred Thackeray. We were both wrong, of course. Eliot was not yet writing. but it was a fine 40 minutes. Dorothea set the journal on her knee and looked at Thomas's empty chair and smiled. A smile that was also something else. The something else that had lived alongside every smile concerning Thomas for the past 8 years, and that she had come to accept as simply the permanent condition of loving someone who was no longer there to receive it. He preferred Dickens, she thought. He always preferred Dickens. In the morning, she went into the garden before breakfast. This was the last October she would do this, and she knew it, and she went anyway, because the knowledge that something is ending does not mean you should skip the ending. It means she had long believed that you should be present for it, with particular attention. The garden was small, 30 feet by 20, walled on 3 sides by the stone that was this part of Lincolnshire's primary building material, and on the 4th side by the kitchen wall. Thomas had called it a jewel box garden, which was slightly sentimental, but also accurate. Within it, over 31 years, Dorothea had created what she privately considered one of the better small gardens in the county, though she had never said so aloud, as this would have been not only immodest, but also the kind of claim that invited contradiction. The Michaelmas daisies were at their height, a full stand of them against the right wall, purple-white, the colour of autumn itself distilled into a flower. The old apple tree at the far wall had dropped its last fruit. 3 small windfalls lay in the long grass below it, yellow-green, soft. The herb bed along the south wall, rosemary still silver-green, sage beginning to go leathery, thyme low and compact. The stone path down the centre, moss-edged. She had sat on the grey wooden bench on the left side of the garden and breathed. The air smelled of damp stone and the faint sweetness of the fallen apples, and something that was simply the smell of autumn, decomposing leaf and cold earth, and the clean cold that hadn't fully arrived yet, but was sending its advance notice in the mornings. She had bought the garden with the house, and had been disappointed in it then. Bare and neglected and small, she had dug and planted and divided and replanted for 31 years. The garden had, as a consequence, her fingerprints all over it in the most literal possible sense. She had turned every cubic foot of its soil at least 3 times. The people who bought this house would not know this. She sat with this thought. It was not quite a sad thought. It was the thought you had about anything you had worked at for a long time, that the work was the thing, not the ownership of the results. The garden would continue. The Michaelmas daisies would spread if they were allowed to. The rosemary would live for 20 more years if it was left alone. The gardener passes on, she had written somewhere in the middle journals. The garden continues. She had been less resigned about it then than she was now. She had kept teaching after she married. This was not quite unusual. Not entirely unusual, but it was unusual enough that she had written about it in the 1854 journal with the particular care of someone documenting something that might later require explanation. I have told the committee that I intend to continue in the school. Mr. Blackmore looks as if he has swallowed something unfortunate. Thomas finds this expression on Mr. Blackmore's face as delightful as I do, which is one of many reasons I have married him. I am aware that Mrs. Blackmore has told Mrs. Patterson that it is quite irregular, and she cannot imagine what Thomas must think. What Thomas thinks, as he has told me, is that a woman who has taught for 6 years and knows how to do it well is not improved by being asked to stop because of a change in her domestic arrangements. Thomas's opinion has the advantage of being both correct and convenient, which is a rare combination in any opinion. She had loved Thomas, Dorothea thought, reading this, with more thoroughness than she had known at the time. The way you cannot see the whole of a landscape when you are standing in it, can only see its whole from a distance. From 62, looking back at 28, she could see what she had had. He had never, in 25 years of marriage, told her to be smaller than she was. He had never found her ambitions inconvenient. He had read every journal entry she showed him, which was not all of them but many, and he had commented on them with the care of someone who understood that these were not a woman's diary in the dismissive sense of the word, but a record of how a mind was working. He believes I am interesting, she had written in 1855, with the small brackets she used for irony, and then the brackets absent. I think he may be right. She closed the 1854 journal carefully, put it aside, not in the trunk, but in a separate stack on the study floor, a stack that was beginning to accumulate. The journals she had already read. The stack was only 4 high. The trunk still held 36 years of her. She thought, I had better make more tea. She thought, I have 6 weeks until the sale. She thought, that is enough. Cora Baines arrived on Wednesday morning with a tin of shortbread and the news of the town, and Dorothea was glad of both. Cora was 61 and had lived in Ramsby all her life, which gave her an authority about the town that Dorothea, merely a 40-year resident, could not quite match. She was a small woman with broad hands and grey-brown hair that she pinned with more optimism than success, and she had been Dorothea's closest friend since the year they had both served on the library subscription committee and had disagreed about everything and discovered, in the disagreement, that they were in fact of the same mind. She came in, saw the journals stacked on the sitting room table, and said, Have you been reading those? I have. All of them. I've made a start. Cora sat down in the chair across from Dorothea's, not Thomas's chair, the chair that had come from the kitchen in the months after his death, when Dorothea had found she could not sit in the sitting room alone with his chair visibly present, but also could not move it, and folded her hands. And I was much funnier at 22 than I had remembered. You have always been funny, Cora said. You simply don't do it out loud. This was true. Dorothea had a sense of humour that expressed itself primarily in writing, and occasionally in the expression on her face, which those who knew her well could read clearly, and those who didn't could not. Cora had always been able to read it. I've been finding things I had forgotten, Dorothea said. Specific things. Things I thought I hadn't noticed. But you had. I had. She looked at the stack of red journals, 7 now, a modest column of dark green leather. I was paying closer attention than I knew. Cora considered this. She was the kind of friend who did not fill a silence simply because it was there. This was, in Dorothea's considered opinion, one of the rarest and most undervalued human qualities. That doesn't surprise me, Cora said, eventually. You always notice things. I thought I was too busy to notice things. You thought that, Cora agreed. But what you thought and what you did were not always the same thing. This seemed to Dorothea so entirely accurate that she could not immediately respond to it. They drank tea and ate the shortbread, which was very good. Outside, the October rain that had been threatening all morning arrived. The 1858 entry was not one she remembered. It was the sort of memory that had been thoroughly absorbed, dissolved into the general accumulation of her teaching years, and so reading it now had the quality of reading something that had happened to someone else, except that the precision of the detail told her it had unquestionably happened to her. March the 15th, 1858. Ada Cropper has left the school. I have been aware for 2 terms that I am not reaching her. She is 13, which is old for our school. Most children leave at 12, and her family has kept her on because her father believes, correctly, that she is clever, but she sits in the schoolroom with the expression of someone enduring a minor but persistent inconvenience, and I cannot find the way in. Today, she left. She has gone to work at the draper's. Her father brought me a note from her. The note read, "Thank you for trying, Mrs. Marsh. I know you did. I know you did." As if trying were sufficient. As if the attempt excused the failure. I have failed this child. Dorothea stopped at this and thought, I believed that for years. The journal continued. I will make a note of her name in the separate ledger I keep of children I should have done better by, of which she is the 43rd entry, and will not be the last. She had kept such a ledger. She remembered it now. A small black notebook, separate from the journals, which she had kept for the first 20 years of teaching, and then stopped keeping. Not because she had stopped failing children, but because she had come to understand something about the relationship between failure and time. She turned to the next entry. March the 23rd, 1858. Ada Cropper's father came to the school today. He tells me she is reading every book she can find at the draper's, has apparently arranged a small library for herself in the back room with the owner's permission, and reads in her dinner hour. He asks if I could recommend volumes for her. I have sent 6 books. Dorothea read this and sat for a moment. Then she read it again. She had forgotten that. She had kept the entry about failing Ada Cropper for 40 years, and she had completely forgotten the one a week later that showed what Ada had done with the leaving, had gone away, and read, I know you did. Perhaps that was not resignation. Perhaps that was a 13-year-old girl who had understood something more accurately than her teacher. She went to the market on Thursday. This was the last October market she would attend in Ramsby, and she went as she had always gone, with her basket and her list and her coat and the particular state of mind she had always brought to the market, which was a combination of purpose and unhurriedness that she had come to think of as the correct approach to any activity worth doing. The market square on a Thursday in October, the cheese stall with its great wheels of double Gloucester and the small wedges of crumbly white Cheshire, the vegetable stalls with their autumn abundance, root vegetables piled high, the last of the runner beans, winter squash in their various yellows and oranges, the baker from the village 3 miles out who came with bread that was better than anything baked in the town itself, and who had been coming every Thursday for as long as Dorothea had been coming to the market. She had written about this market in the journals repeatedly. It appeared in her first journal, the first October entry, 1848. The market square is extraordinary. I had not expected to find extraordinary things in a small market town, but here they are, every Thursday. It appeared in the 1875 journal, 49th market of this year. I have stopped counting the total number of markets I have attended here since it became a larger number than I find useful to contemplate. And she knew, without needing to look, that it appeared in the most recent journal in some form because the market was simply part of the texture of this life. One of the things she had done consistently for 40 years, the way you breathe. She bought cheese and bread and the last of the season's apples from a woman she had been buying apples from for 20 years, whose name was Margaret, and whose daughter Dorothea had taught, and whose granddaughter Dorothea had also taught, which was one of the more satisfying aspects of staying in one place for a long time. "I hear you're leaving us, Mrs. Marsh," Margaret said. "I am," Dorothea said. "In November. Will you miss it?" Dorothea looked at the market square, the stalls, the crowd, the stone, the particular quality of the October light on the tower of the church at the far end. "I believe I already do," she said. "I think I have been missing it since I decided to go." Margaret wrapped her apples in paper. "That's the way of it," she said, with the equanimity of someone who has stood in the market square for 40 years and watched people come and go and apple prices fluctuate, and found that life contains all of it without becoming excessive. "Yes," said Dorothea, "I believe it is." The 1862 journal was the first difficult one. Not difficult to read, difficult in what it recorded. She had known it was coming, turning to it, the way you know certain chapters of your own story before you arrive at them. She had been 36 that year, Thomas 40, and in November of 1862, there had been the first serious illness, the first long weeks of uncertainty that she had written through, because writing was how she survived difficult things, had always been how she survived them. Writing was the act of imposing enough structure on the formless weight of fear that it became, however temporarily, manageable. November the 2nd, 1862. Thomas has been unwell since Thursday. Dr. Pemberton has been twice. He says it is a fever and that it will resolve, but that we must be patient. I am not constitutionally a patient woman. I teach patience to children while practicing something else entirely in private, which I suppose makes me no different from any other teacher of virtues. I have sat with him each evening. He sleeps badly, and I read to him until he sleeps well. We are currently working through Trollope's Barchester series, which he finds soothing. I find it somewhat less soothing, as the politics of cathedral chapters are not at present my primary concern, but I read it with what I hope is convincing equanimity. He said last night, half asleep, "You don't have to stay." I said, "I'm aware of that." He said, "I'm glad you do." I said, "So am I." He went to sleep. I sat with him until 11 and went to bed and could not sleep, and thought about the 40 or 50 years I intend us to have, and then thought about contingency, and then thought about Trollope, and went to sleep. The fever broke in December. Thomas was well by Christmas. She had written on the 1st of January, 1863. I am not a religious woman in any formal sense, but I find myself grateful in a way that does not require an object and does not diminish for lacking one. We are here. We are both here. I intend to treat this as the ordinary miracle it is. Dorothea set this journal on the stack of red ones. It was the 9th now, and sat for a while, looking at the fire. She had been frightened that November. She had not written the fear directly, because she was not in the habit of writing fear directly. But it was all there in the grammar, in the short sentences, in the sentences that began with I and ended quickly, in the Trollope passage that was clearly not about Trollope. She had been very frightened, and Thomas had not died, and she had been grateful for 20 more years. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the accounting of such things, a great deal. On Friday afternoon, she sorted the books. She did it properly this time, moved through the shelves systematically, taking each book down, making a decision, placing it in one of the 3 piles. The 3 piles were now named: Bath, the books she was taking; the Ramsby Library, the books she was donating; and the auction house, the books she could not give away but did not need. It went better than the first attempt, partly because she was more decisive after several days of living with the evidence of her own life, and partly because she had discovered that the decision about each book was actually easy if she asked the right question. The right question was not, do I love this book? She loved almost all of them. But do I need this book with me? These were different questions. The first concerned the past. The second concerned what came next. She was getting better at asking about what came next. George Eliot went to Bath. All of her, without question. Trollope went to Bath. The Barchester books, specifically, for reasons that had nothing to do with their literary merit, and everything to do with November 1862. Hardy's early work went to Bath. Hardy had not yet written his greatest novels. Tess would not appear for another 3 years, Jude after that. But Far from the Madding Crowd and The Return of the Native had been with her since her 30s and had taught her things about landscape and attention that she thought about every time she walked the Lincolnshire fields. Elizabeth Gaskell went to Bath. Cranford went to Bath in particular, because Cranford was a book about the extraordinary things that ordinary women built in ordinary places without anyone remarking on it. And she had loved it since the first, reading and loved it more after 30 years. The scientific volumes, Thomas's mostly, plus her own collection on natural history and botany, were a harder question. She sat with several of them for a long time. Thomas would have said, "Take the ones you'll read. Leave the ones you keep for the sake of having them." She took the ones she would read. The sitting room, by evening, had a different quality. Emptier at the shelves, but not emptier in itself. As if the room had been returned to its essentials and was resting more comfortably. She made tea and sat in the resulting quiet and found it good. The flooding happened in the spring of 1865, when the River Nen rose above its bank and filled the lower streets for 4 days, and Dorothea had written about it with the full attention she brought to anything she was trying to understand and had not yet understood. March the 10th, 1865. The water is in the market square now. 4 feet at the deepest point, Mr. Hargreaves says, though he is the kind of man who measures by instinct rather than instrument, and may be optimistic. The Coopers on Mill Street have come to stay with us. Mrs. Cooper and her 3 children, and her mother, who is 91, and entirely tranquil about the situation. I find Mrs. Cooper's mother a great comfort. She has survived things I cannot yet imagine, and she drinks her tea with an equanimity I intend to study. March the 14th. The water is retreating. We have had 8 people in this house for 4 days, and I have cooked more food and managed more different requirements simultaneously than I knew I was capable of. Thomas has been magnificent. He organized the rescue of the Petersons' furniture by boat. I organized everything else. It turns out that a crisis reveals what you are capable of, which I knew in theory, but have not previously had the occasion to test at scale. March the 15th. The Coopers have gone home. The house is extraordinarily quiet. I have realized that I enjoyed it. She had written that last line without brackets, Dorothea noted, without irony, as a plain statement of fact. She had enjoyed the flooding. She had enjoyed having a house full of people who needed things. The specific satisfaction of being useful in the most practical and immediate sense. Food, warmth, organization, the particular steadiness that others drew on. She had not known this about herself until the water rose. The journals were full of such moments, moments where the event had been the teacher. The flooding had taught her that she was good in a crisis, that she was more capable than she had thought, that she found satisfaction in the management of complex human need. It had taken the water rising to show her this, but once shown she had not forgotten it. She had used it for 23 more years. The letter arrived on Saturday morning, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. She opened it at the kitchen table with her tea, standing rather than sitting, because she always opened her Morning Post standing, a habit from the years of teaching, when the Morning Post might contain something requiring immediate action, and sitting down for it seemed to imply more leisure than she possessed. Dear Mrs. Marsh, the letter read, "You will not remember me. I was in your class in 1874 when I was 9 years old, which means I am now 23. My name was Jane Platt. I am now Jane Middleton, which I mention only because the name has changed. I am writing because I have heard from my mother that you are leaving Ramsby, and I wanted to write before you left. I have wanted to write to you for some time. I have started this letter 6 times in the last 2 years and sent none of them because I could not find the right way to say what I meant to say. I will try again. You taught me to read properly, not to sound out the letters. I could do that already. To read the way that matters, to understand that a sentence was not a collection of words, but a thought, and that a paragraph was not a collection of sentences, but an argument, and that a book was not a collection of pages, but a world that a person had made and left for you. I did not know any of this when I was 9. I knew it by the time I was 10. I am a teacher now. I have been teaching for 3 years in a village school in Rutland. I think about what you taught me every day, not consciously. It has simply become how I think about teaching. I don't know if teachers know what they pass on. I suspect many of them don't. I wanted you to know. Yours sincerely, Jane Middleton, née Platt. Dorothea read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen table. Then she sat down. The winter of 1870 had been hard, not in the dramatic sense, not a disaster that could be dated and named, but in the slower sense of an accumulation of small difficulties. A cold winter that stayed cold well into April. Poor harvests the previous autumn. several families in the town whose situations had become genuinely precarious in the way that situations became precarious in the 1870s in market towns in the agricultural Midlands, quietly, without announcement, behind closed doors. She had written about it with care. February the 8th, 1870. The Wilsons are managing on very little. Mrs. Wilson does not say so. She brings Alice and Robert to school with clean faces and patched but decent clothes, and does not ask for anything. I have learned that not asking is the most difficult form of need to address, because it requires the helper to act without invitation, which requires a kind of certainty about the rightness of acting that does not come naturally to me. I have brought food to the house twice on the pretext of having made more than Thomas and I need. Thomas has, without discussion, made sure that this pretext is always accurate. He says nothing about this. I love him for it. Robert Wilson is 8 years old and is the most determined child I have taught in 22 years. I believe he will do something with this determination, but cannot yet predict what. She turned forward several pages. April the 3rd, 1870. The Wilsons have come through the winter. The difficult part is over. I do not write about Mrs. Wilson in these pages very often because she would not wish to be written about, and I hold to that wish even in private. But today I want to record. She brought me a bunch of violets from her garden. They are the first flowers of the spring. She said, "Thank you for the stews, Mrs. Marsh." I said, "What stews?" She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh all winter. Dorothea set the journal down and thought about the violets. She had kept them in a glass on the kitchen windowsill until they faded, and then had pressed one of them in the back of the journal, which she had forgotten until just now. Turned to the back cover and found it. A single dried violet, flat and brown, still faintly violet-shaped. She held it in her palm and thought about Mrs. Wilson, who had died in 1883, and whose Robert had grown up to be an engineer in Sheffield and had come back to Ramsby for her funeral. Small acts, the violets, the stews that were never called stews, the winter come through, unhistorical. She had read Middlemarch as it was published in 8 parts between 1871 and 1872, and she had written about each part in the journal she was keeping that year. She found the entries now with the interest of someone who had spent 50 years living with a book and was curious to see what she had made of it at first encounter. December the 1st, 1871, the first book of Middlemarch. I have read it in 2 days, which is longer than I wanted to take, but shorter than respectful attention requires. The character of Dorothea Brooke seems to me entirely true in the way that fictional characters only occasionally manage. True not in the sense of resembling a specific person one knows, but in the sense of resembling a condition of human experience one recognizes. She wants too much. She is too much. The world is too small for what she intends to be. I find her, if I am honest, somewhat uncomfortable to read. Dorothea Marsh, 62, reading this entry, thought, "Yes, I imagine you did." The journal continued through the subsequent parts as they were published across the following year. Book 4, June 1872. I have now read the part where Dorothea, in her grief about Casaubon and her confused feelings about Ladislaw, goes to see Rosamond Vincy, who she believes has been unkind to Will, and comforts her instead. She gives up her own anger for someone else's need. She does it in the night. She does it alone. Nobody sees it. Eliot calls these things unhistoric acts. I have been thinking about this phrase for 3 days. I think she means the things that matter and are not recorded, the kindnesses that happen in rooms nobody else enters, the teaching that happens one child at a time, the conversations that change someone's direction without either party knowing it at the time. I think this is the truest thing I have read. Dorothea sat with this for a long time. She had written those words at 46. She had been a teacher for 24 years at that point, and she had already understood, theoretically, abstractly, what Eliot was describing. But at 46, she had not yet experienced it from the receiving end. She had not yet received Jane Middleton's letter, or the letter that would come 3 years from now, or the one after that. She had understood it in theory. She understood it now with the whole weight of the evidence. She read late that night. She had not intended to read late, had intended to eat supper, read for an hour, sleep at the reasonable hour of 10. But the journals had a momentum once she was in them that was difficult to interrupt. Each one she finished led naturally to the next, and the next seemed always to contain something she needed before she could stop. By 11 o'clock, she had read through 1873 and was deep in 1874. The fire had been built up twice. The oil lamp had been refilled. The white cup had been refilled 4 times. And on the most recent occasion, she had added a small measure of whiskey to the tea, which she did not normally do, but which seemed appropriate to the hour and the occasion. The sitting room at 11 at night had a quality particular to itself. The lamp's amber circle catching the center of the room, the edges in warm shadow, the fire a source of heat, and the particular orange-red light of coal well burned. Thomas's empty chair on the right was at the edge of the lamplight, partly shadowed, present and not present, as it always was. She thought, sitting in the silence with the journal on her lap and the fire burning low. I have been a reasonably good teacher for 40 years. Not great. She was not inclined to grant herself great, but she had been consistent, and she had been attentive, and she had improved across 4 decades in the ways that mattered, in her ability to see what a child needed before the child could say it, in her patience with the children who required more patience than she naturally had, in her management of the complex, small community of a classroom. She had been, she believed, better at 60 than at 22, and better at 50 than at 40, which was the right direction. She had also been, and this was not something she had expected to conclude from 40 years of her own journals, considerably kinder than she had given herself credit for. She had remembered the failures. She had not, it seemed, properly remembered the successes. The journals held them all equally. She looked at the fire. She looked at Thomas's chair. I kept the wrong ledger, she thought. For 20 years I kept a ledger of failures. I should have kept both. She did not mean this with grief. She meant it as a practical observation about accounting. The fire settled. She added more coal. She picked up the next journal. It was past midnight. She read on. She had not, she realized, properly remembered Mrs. Platt. The journals remembered her. 4 entries in 1872, 2 in 1873, 1 in 1874. A woman who had lived next door to Ash House for 3 years, while her husband was working in Leeds, and who had had, in those 3 years, a great many needs that she had expressed in small, oblique ways that Dorothea had learned to interpret. January the 14th, 1872. Mrs. Platt came to borrow flour. She came yesterday for sugar and the day before for salt. She is clearly not running short of household staples. She is lonely. I have invited her for tea on Thursday, and she has accepted with a relief she has tried to disguise as mere politeness. March the 2nd, 1872. Mrs. Platt and I have established a Wednesday afternoon arrangement. Thomas calls her my visiting hours. I call it being a neighbour in the literal sense of the word, which has always seemed to me to mean being near, being available, being the person who is there when there is not yet something specific to need. September the 8th, 1872. Mrs. Platt told me today that the 3 years here have been the most difficult of her life, and also the years she has felt least alone in her difficulty. She said, "I don't know how you knew to come." I said, "I didn't know anything. I was just there. She is going back to Leeds on Friday." She cried, which she apologized for. I told her that apologies for honest feeling were not necessary in my house. She laughed, and then cried again, and then pulled herself together with a thoroughness I very much respected. Dorothea read this and thought I had forgotten her entirely. She had not forgotten her in the important sense. She would have known the name, placed the face, could have described the Wednesday afternoons if asked, but she had not thought of Mrs. Platt in, she estimated, 20 years. The specific weight of those 3 years, the particular person who had needed a particular kind of presence, this had been absorbed into the general accumulation and lost its specificity. The journals gave it back. She thought, how many others were there? How many people who had needed something specific and received it, and whose names were somewhere in these pages? The answer, reading through 40 years of closely observed life in one small town, was rather a lot, more than she had known, considerably more than she had given herself credit for. She had been 47 in the summer of 1873, and the Garden Journal entries from that July and August were unlike anything else in the journals, less dense, more sensory, written in the particular way she had written when the world was offering itself up for attention, and she was equal to receiving it. July the 3rd, 1873. The garden. The sweet peas have reached the top of the canes, higher than I planned, and the scent at this hour of the morning, just before 7, is extraordinary in the way that only sweet peas in early July can be extraordinary, sweet without being heavy, a sweetness that moves when you move toward it, that seems to come from slightly further away than it is. The roses on the south wall, the old apothecary's rose, which was here when we came and which I have never managed to identify definitively, but which blooms once in late June with a depth of pink that is almost red, and whose scent is the scent I smell when I am very tired and trying to remember something good. It has finished now, and the hips are forming. Thomas brought his chair into the garden this morning and worked out there for 2 hours. He looked entirely right in the garden. He has always looked entirely right wherever he is, which is one of the qualities I noticed early and have never stopped being grateful for. She had drawn a small diagram in the margin of this entry, a rough plan of the garden as it stood In 1873, marking each plant's position, the roses on the south wall, the sweet peas at the far end, the lavender hedge that she had since replaced with rosemary, the bench on the left side. The bench was still there. Most of the rest had been revised in the years since. She thought about the summer of 1873 and tried to recall it from inside the memory rather than from outside the journal entry. What she could retrieve, reading the precise sensory descriptions, with the quality of those mornings, the specific sweetness of the sweet peas, the way Thomas had sat in the garden with his papers, the particular contentment of that summer, not a dramatic contentment, not the happiness of an event, but the settled happiness of a life in its middle years that was being lived as it ought to be lived. She had been 47, and she had not known it was particularly good. She knew now. Pay attention, she thought, to herself at 47, 25 years ago. Not paying attention. It is particularly good. On Saturday morning, she put on her cloak and walked to her old schoolroom. The new school, built in 1865, the year of the flooding, was on the Kettering Road, a proper building with 2 classrooms and a cloakroom and windows large enough to admit genuine light. She had taught in it for 21 years and approved of it thoroughly. But it had not been her first schoolroom, and it had not been the schoolroom she was thinking of. The original school building still stood on the far side of the market square, which had become, in the decades since, successively, a storage building, a printer's workshop, and most recently the premises of a clockmaker who had moved to Coventry the previous spring and whose shop was now empty, the sign still up, the door locked. She stood outside it for a moment. A small stone building, 2 windows facing the square, the original iron stove visible through the dusty glass, still in the corner. The floor was the same flagged stone. She could see through the right window the marks on the far wall where 30 years of chalk dust had settled into the stone. She had stood in front of that wall for 9 years. She had stood in front of it on the 1st of October, 1848, at 22 years old, with 17 children looking at her. And she had thought. She remembered this. It was in the first journal, but she remembered it independently of the journal. Well, here we are then. Here they were. Here she was. Here was the stone building with the iron stove in the corner and the chalk on the far wall, unchanged, while she had changed entirely, while the children she had taught had grown and had children of their own, while Thomas had lived and died, while 31 years had passed in the house on Church Street. She looked at the building for a long time. Then she turned and walked back across the market square, through the smell of damp stone and the cold November morning, and went home to read more of the journals. She estimated, 21 left to read. She estimated, 5.5 weeks left in the house. There was enough time. She had not expected it when it happened. In the journal of 1876, there was an entry from May that she read 3 times because the first time she read it, she was so absorbed in remembering the event that she did not read it properly. And the second time, she read it properly but with something interfering, the old feeling of disbelief that had attended the original event. And only the third time did she read it simply and clearly. May the 17th, 1876. Ellen Hargreave has been accepted at Girton College, Cambridge. That was the first sentence, and she had underlined it. The only underlined sentence in 40 years of journals. She told me this afternoon after school, in the empty classroom, standing in the particular way that Ellen stands when she is trying not to show that she is very moved, very straight, very precise, looking slightly to the right of my head. She said, "I wanted you to know first." I said, "I'm glad." I meant considerably more than that, and she understood, which is one of the things I have always valued about Ellen Hargreave. She is 18, and she is going to Cambridge, and she will do something with it that I cannot predict, and that is not my business to predict. My business has been to teach her what I know and to tell her when she was 15 and had just written the finest essay I had received in 28 years of teaching, that she should take herself seriously. I said, "Ellen, you should take yourself seriously." She looked at me, the specific look she has, the one that is simultaneously skeptical and grateful, and said, "Should I?" I said, "Yes." Unambiguously, yes. I believe she took me seriously. Dorothea set the journal down. Ellen Hargreave, who had become Dr. Ellen Hargreave Price, who had written a monograph on the education of women that Dorothea still had on her shelves, going to Bath, unquestionably, one of the first books placed in that pile. Who sent a Christmas card every year with a careful note about her current work. She thought about the afternoon in the empty schoolroom in 1876. Ellen, 18, straight-backed, trying not to show that she was moved. Herself, 50, trying not to show either. Should I? Yes. Unambiguously, yes. All the rest had followed from that. She had written very little in the autumn of 1878. The entries were brief, shorter than any period in 40 years, and they had a quality she recognized now, reading them, as the quality of someone writing in the margins of their real life, writing enough to maintain the habit, writing enough to feel that there was something to hold on to, but not writing the thing itself. The thing itself was too large and too close and too uncertain to be written. September the 1st, 1878. Thomas is managing well. Dr. Pemberton is pleased with the progress of the last month. October the 14th, 1878. A quiet week. The garden is beautiful. November the 3rd, 1878. Thomas asked me to read to him this evening. We read Hardy, The Return of the Native. He fell asleep at chapter 4, and I read 3 more chapters after he was asleep, which I have done since the illness in 1862, and which I find as valuable as any other kind of reading. November the 22nd, 1878. The first real frost, and then, several weeks later, in a different quality of handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had not written for a long time and was writing again with difficulty. December the 15th, 1878. Thomas died on the 9th. I find I cannot write about it yet. I am recording the date so that I will not have to rely on memory for the facts, since memory is not, at present, my most reliable faculty. He preferred Dickens. He was right about almost everything else. She had not written again in that journal. The next journal began in March of 1879. Dorothea sat for a long time with the 1878 journal closed on her lap. She was not weeping. She had wept for Thomas, thoroughly and appropriately, in the years after his death, and she was not going to do it again now At 62 in a sitting room in October, she told herself, simply sitting with the knowledge, the exact knowledge, of what that winter had cost. She was also sitting with the knowledge of what she had done after it. The next journal was in the trunk. She would read it tomorrow. She put the 1878 journal on the stack of read ones very carefully with 2 hands. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She had not slept well since Thomas died, had developed over 8 years a settled and practical relationship with insomnia that involved lying in the dark for 40 minutes, getting up, making tea, reading until sleep came again, which it usually did by 2 or 3 in the morning. She had concluded during this period that the body requires a certain quantity of sleep and will eventually claim it, and that fighting the insomnia with anxiety produced a worse outcome than accommodating it with tea and a book. Tonight, the journal served the purpose of the book. She came downstairs at midnight, made tea in the dark kitchen. She knew the kitchen well enough to navigate it without a lamp, and went into the sitting room and built the fire up and read the 1879 journal, which was Thomas's first year and her own, and which was, she had known it would be, the hardest one. March the 4th, 1879. I have been at the school every day. This has been the correct decision. The children require my attention in a way that is both demanding and useful. It is useful, I find, to be needed. March the 11th. I have had letters from many people. I have replied to all of them. I have found the replies more difficult to write than anything else I have ever written, but I am not sure why. They are short letters mostly, and the content is simply, "Thank you. I am managing. Yes, I am sure. I am managing. I am not sure." March the 22nd. I went into Thomas's study today to find the Pemberton papers. It was the first time I had been in it since. The room had his smell, the particular combination of old books and pipe tobacco, and something else I cannot name, that was simply him. I stood in the middle of the room for 10 minutes, and then found the Pemberton papers, and went back to the kitchen and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. I am making a great deal of tea. Dorothea, 62, at 2 in the morning, drinking tea by the fire with this journal in her lap, read this and thought, yes, that is exactly right. I was making enormous quantities of tea. She had managed. She looked around the sitting room in the small hours, the lamp, the fire she had rebuilt, Thomas's empty chair in the warm amber light, and thought, I have been managing for 8 years. I have been managing well. She drank her tea. She read on. She read the 1879 journal through to the end. And then she set it on the pile and sat with it for a while before picking up the next one. What the 1879 journal showed was not what she had expected to find. She had expected to find grief, and grief was there, but it was not the predominant note. The predominant note was, of all things, practical. April the 8th, 1879. I have reorganized the study. This was necessary in a functional sense, and I did it with as much attention to function as I could manage. Thomas's papers are filed. The shelves are arranged by subject rather than by acquisition order, which was Thomas's system and which I have never found intuitive. I feel, doing this, that I am making the room mine, which is both right and wrong simultaneously. It is right, because the house is mine and I should inhabit all of it. It is wrong because But it is not wrong. It is simply not easy. May the 12th. I have begun a new botanical notebook. This is not a journal. It is for observation only. I record what the garden does and when. I find the precision calming. The garden does not vary significantly from the expected. It blooms and seeds and dies back according to the seasonal contract it has always honored. There is something steadying about an entity that keeps its promises. June the 30th. That entry consisted of those 2 words and nothing else. She had run out of something that day and had opened the journal and written only the date and closed it again. She understood that entry completely. She did not need to have been 34 years younger to understand it. July the 4th. I am teaching well this term. Better, possibly, than any previous term. I think this is because I have reached the particular configuration of grief and work where the grief has become fuel rather than impediment. I do not recommend the process, but I note the outcome. She had been 43, and she had been exactly right about the outcome. She had taught well for 17 more years. The following afternoon, she sat in Thomas's chair. She had not done this in 8 years. She had come close several times in the first year, had stood beside it, had laid her hand on the arm, had once sat on the very edge of it for approximately 30 seconds before standing up again. But she had not properly sat in it. She was not sure what she had been waiting for. Some permission, perhaps. Some readiness she would recognize when it arrived. She recognized it now. She moved to the right side of the fireplace, where his chair stood in the position it had always stood in. She had never moved it. It had never needed moving, and she sat down in it properly. The seat was slightly firmer than hers from less use. The burgundy velvet was not worn. It fit her differently than her own chair, was oriented slightly differently toward the fire, gave her a slightly different angle on the room. She could see her own chair from here, and the table beside it with her reading glasses and her cup and the current journal. She could see the room as he had seen it. He had sat here, across from her, for 25 years. He had sat here while she read to him, while she told him about the children at school, while she thought aloud in the way that required someone on the other side of the fire to receive the thinking. He had sat here and read, and they had been quiet together in the particular way of 2 people who have learned each other's silences. She sat in his chair and looked at the room. It was, and this was not what she had expected, ordinary. The room was ordinary, and the chair was ordinary, and she was sitting in it in the ordinary light of a November afternoon. And nothing was different from what it always was, except that she was on this side of the fire rather than the other. The world was the same size from here. She sat for 20 minutes. Then she got up, went back to her own chair, picked up the next journal, and read. The 1882 journal had an energy she had not expected, a brightness in the writing she recognized, reading it as the energy of someone who had found their footing again after a long, uncertain period, and was now walking with confidence. September the 1st, 1882. New term. 32 children. I find I am glad. September the 8th. There is a child in the 3rd year, Margaret Blaw, 8 years old, who asks more questions in a single morning than any child I have taught. The quality of the questions varies enormously. Some are sharp, and some are simply her way of processing the world aloud. but the volume of them is extraordinary. I have decided to treat the questions as a resource rather than a disruption, which requires some adjustment to how I manage the room, but seems to produce better results for Margaret Blaw and, interestingly, for everyone else. October the 3rd. Thomas used to say that the good teachers he had known shared one quality. They were more interested in the children than in their own authority. I have been thinking about this lately. I believe he was right. The teachers I remember from my own schooling who taught me anything were the ones who were genuinely curious about what I thought. The ones who were primarily concerned with their own authority taught me the curriculum and nothing else. She had written Thomas's observation into the journal nearly 4 years after his death, as naturally as if he had said it that morning. This was, she thought, exactly right. His observations had not ended with his death. She had simply been carrying them and deploying them as occasions arose, as one does with the knowledge of anyone you have known long enough. The 1882 journal was the year she had begun to be good again, she thought. Not that she had been bad in the intervening years. She had been, as she had written, teaching well, using grief as fuel. But in 1882, she had been 36 years a teacher and 56 years old, and she had found a kind of authority. Not the authority of position, but the authority of depth. That was different from anything she had had before. Margaret Blaw had grown up to be a journalist. Of course she had. She went into the garden on Sunday morning and did what needed to be done. This was practical and necessary, and she approached it practically and necessarily, cutting back the spent Michaelmas daisy stems. They had finished now, late October, the flowers gone to grey seed heads, the stems dry, dividing the larger clumps of herbs, tying back the rosemary so it would not sprawl through the winter, pulling up the last annuals and adding them to the compost. The work of the autumn garden, the work of preparing something for a season you will not be there for. She had known this all month was the work she was doing. She had been working in the garden as if there would be a spring. She had ordered bulbs from the Kettering nursery, which had arrived the previous Tuesday, 50 tulip bulbs in brown paper parcels, and had planted them all methodically along the south wall where the light was best. She would not see them bloom. Whoever lived here next would see them bloom next April or May without knowing who had planted them, without knowing that the woman who had planted them had spent 40 years in this house and had known, planting the bulbs, that they were for someone else. This was not, she had decided, a sad act. It was an act of confidence in the spring. She finished the cutting back and sat on the bench in the bare garden with her cup of tea, her breath showing in the cold air, the garden stripped back to its structure, the stone walls, the central path, the old apple tree against the far wall, bare now except for one mist windfall high in the branches that had somehow survived the October winds. I have lived here for 31 years, she thought. I have made something good here, not a grand something, not a something that would be recorded or remarked upon, a small, well-made, quietly flourishing something, a garden, a household, a life in a town, 40 years of children taught and people helped and presence maintained. The something was real. She had the evidence. In the journal of 1884, there was a letter, not a reference to a letter, an actual letter, folded into the pages, which she had apparently kept there for 4 years, without remembering she had kept it there. She unfolded it carefully. The paper softened at the creases from years of sitting folded in a journal, and read it in the November afternoon light. The handwriting was a woman's, careful and somewhat effortful, the handwriting of someone who had not had much practice. Dear Mrs. Marsh, I hope you will forgive the liberty of a letter from a stranger. My name is Sarah Hollis, and I am 31 years old. I do not think you will remember me. I was in your class in the winter of 1862 for only 1 term, because my family moved to Stamford in the spring of 1863. I was 9 years old. I am writing because my daughter has just started school, and her teacher has told me she is exceptional and should be encouraged, and I found myself thinking, someone told me that once. You told me that. I do not remember your exact words. I remember the feeling, which was that someone who knew about such things had looked at me and found something worth looking at. I do not know if teachers know the weight of such moments. I am writing to tell you, in case you do not, that the weight is considerable, that I have carried it for 22 years, that I will carry it for the rest of my life, I expect. I am not an exceptional person, but I was told once that I might be, and this has made an inestimable difference. Yours faithfully, Sarah Hollis Dorothea, had no memory of Sarah Hollis. She had taught over 40 years, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 children. She could not remember them all. She had clearly, in the winter term of 1862, when she had been 36, and Thomas was recovering from his first illness, and she had 16 children, and had been doing her best, and had said something to a 9-year-old that the 9-year-old had carried for 22 years. She read the letter a second time. She thought, I said something right to someone, and they carried it for 22 years. I have no memory of it, but it happened. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back between the pages of the 1884 journal. It had happened. It was real, whether she remembered it or not. She wrote back to Jane Middleton, the teacher in Rutland who had written last week, on Monday morning. She had been composing the reply in her head for several days, which was her usual practice with important letters. Draft them mentally before committing them to paper. Check the drafts against each other. Settle on the version that was most accurate and least excessive. She had a tendency toward excess in personal correspondence that she had spent 30 years learning to moderate, toward saying more than was needed, toward filling the space on the page as if the recipient required filling. The letter she wrote was short. Dear Mrs. Middleton, she wrote, thank you for writing. I'm very glad to know what you have become. I'm more glad to know that what I passed on was genuinely useful, rather than merely received politely. Teaching is a faith-based enterprise in one particular sense. We do most of it without evidence of outcome. We give what we have to children who take it away with them, and we rarely know what they do with it. Your letter is, therefore, unusual. It is evidence. I am grateful for evidence. I have spent the past 2 weeks rereading my journals from 40 years of teaching, which I am doing because I am leaving this house and this town in November, and I am finding that I knew considerably more about what I was doing than I thought I did. I'm also finding that I did considerably more good than I thought I did, which is a late arriving surprise that I am accepting with some humility and a great deal of gratitude. You said you think about what I taught you every day. I think about what I learned from teaching every day. It is the same material from different angles. I wish you and your students very well. Yours faithfully, Dorothea Marsh. She read the letter over once, addressed the envelope, sealed it. She had said exactly what she meant. She thought, I'm getting better at that. It has taken 62 years, but I am getting better at it. The 1886 journal was the last full teaching year. She had been 60 in 1886, and she had known by then that she was going to retire, though she had not announced it until the spring of 1887. She had wanted to teach her 61st year, which she had done, and then she had submitted her resignation to the school board with a letter that had taken 3 weeks to write, and which she had ultimately cut to 2 paragraphs, the second of which said simply, I have had the privilege of teaching in this town for 38 years. I am grateful for it in a way I cannot adequately express. But in 1886, she had not yet told anyone, and the journal entries from that year had a quality she recognized now as the quality of looking at something you know you are going to lose, a heightened attention, a consciousness of each day as finite. September the 22nd, 1886. First autumn term of my final year. I am, I think, as good at this as I have ever been. I am teaching Margaret Blaw's younger sister Clara, who is 8 and nothing like Margaret, quieter, steadier, more deliberate. She has not yet found what she is for. I intend to help her find it. October the 15th. I have been watching the way I teach as I teach, which is a strange experience, like watching yourself walk. I'm trying to understand what I know so that I can know that I know it. I find I can tell within the first week of any term which children need what from me. Not always what they need from learning, that takes longer, but what they need from me specifically. Which ones need to be noticed and which ones need to be left to work. Which ones need to be challenged and which ones need a form of permission. I have been doing this for 38 years. It is now simply how I see a room full of children. I am going to miss seeing rooms full of children. She had missed it for the first full year, the following September, when the school term began and she was not in it, had been difficult in the specific way of missing something essential that you have taken for granted. But she had adjusted, as she had adjusted to everything, by paying attention, by finding what was next, by not requiring the loss to be smaller than it was. Cora came again on Thursday of the final week. She brought shortbread again and sat in the kitchen rather than the sitting room, because the sitting room was in its final stages of packing, and some of the furniture had been moved toward the door, and the kitchen, though cold, was more familiar. They sat at the pine table and drank tea, and ate the shortbread, and Cora looked at the dismantled version of the house that Dorothea had spent a month creating, and said very little about it, which was the correct response. How far are you through the journals? She asked. 37, Dorothea said. 3 left. And Dorothea thought about how to answer this. She was not, she had found, particularly well equipped to summarize 40 years of rereading 40 years of life in a brief answer. But Cora was not asking for a summary. She was asking for the essential thing. I was paying more attention than I knew, she said, which was what she had said in their first conversation about the journals, and which still seemed to be the essential thing. And what did you find, paying attention? I found. She turned her cup in her hands. The white cup with the blue cornflowers, the small chip on the handle. She had been turning this cup in her hands for 31 years. I found that the life I thought I had, which was a good but modest life, a small life with good work in it, is not exactly the life I had. I had more reach than I knew. I had more effect than I knew. She paused. I failed some people. I missed some things. The ledger is not clean, but the other side of the ledger is considerably larger than I had recorded. Yes, said Cora, with the simplicity of someone who has known this all along. You knew, Dorothea said. I knew, Cora agreed, but it's better that you found it yourself. They sat with this for a moment. Then Cora took another piece of shortbread and passed the tin across the table. Have more, she said. You've been reading all month, and you need it. The first autumn without the school had been, as she had expected, strange. The 1887 journal recorded it with the same precision it had recorded everything else. September the 5th, 1887. The children went back to school this morning. I could hear them from the kitchen, the sound of the market square filling up and then emptying, the particular sound of children in collective motion moving in one direction. I listened to it from the kitchen window. It is a sound I have oriented my life around for 39 years. Today it passed without me and continued without me, which is entirely correct and also very strange. September the 8th. I have been reading, I have been gardening, I have been walking, I have been visiting Cora and being visited by Cora. I have been, in other words, doing the things one does when one is not doing the thing one has spent one's life doing. And I find that these things are good things and that I am, as far as I can tell, managing. The managing has a different quality from the teaching. The teaching had urgency. The managing, as yet, simply has itself. September the 22nd. I think I am finding what is next. I am not certain what it is yet, but I can feel the shape of it, the way you can feel the shape of a word before you find it. It involves the garden and the books I have been meaning to read, and possibly the botanical notebook I have been keeping since 1879. And it involves, I think this is the central thing, being present to this stage of life in the way I was present to the teaching. Not marking time until the next thing, but attending to this thing. I am 61 years old. I have the materials for an excellent decade. She read this last sentence and thought, and so you do, and so you still do. She had been 61 when she wrote it, and she was 62 now, and she still had the materials. She was taking them to Bath with her, the books in the pile, the botanical notebooks, the precise quality of attention she had been paying to things for 40 years. None of that was staying in Ash House. All of that was portable. The second to last journal, 1888, the spring and summer entries, was the strangest to read. The handwriting was current. The events were recent. She read herself from 6 months ago with the particular disorientation of recognizing something entirely and also being unable to place it in the historical perspective she had brought to all the earlier entries. April the 3rd, 1888. The tulips on the south wall are quite extraordinary this year. A deep red I did not anticipate from the catalogue description, almost burgundy. I have sat on the bench for a considerable portion of the afternoon. May the 15th. Letter from my sister in Bath. She asks again about the house. I find I am not ready to think about it yet, and have said so. June the 22nd. I have been thinking about what I am, now that I am no longer what I was for so long. I have been a schoolmistress for 40 years. I am now, in the technical sense, a retired schoolmistress. I do not yet fully inhabit this description. August the 1st. I have decided to sell the house. This decision, which I have been avoiding for a year, arrived last Tuesday without drama. I simply knew one morning that it was right. The house is too large for one person, and I have been managing it alone for 8 years, and my sister's house in Bath has a good garden and a library. I will miss Ramsby more than I can describe. I will go. Dorothea set this journal on the stack. She had been right in August. The decision had been right. She had known it then, and she knew it now. Had known it, in fact, the same way she knew most important things, not through deliberate reasoning, but through the quiet accumulation of evidence over time, until the conclusion was simply obvious. She was going. She was ready. One journal remained in the trunk. The last journal, the current one, begun in September, was the thinnest of all. It covered only 6 weeks. She had written in it every few days since September, and reading it now felt least like reading at all, and most like standing very close to a mirror, the reflection too near and too large and too current to give the perspective that distance provides. She read it anyway. September the 30th, 1888. The house is going on the market. Mr. Fenwick has made his assessments, has named a number which seems to me both fair and somehow beside the point. I am not selling this house for money. What am I doing? I am releasing it. I am releasing it to be somebody else's house, while it is still good enough to be somebody else's good house. October the 3rd. I have begun reading the old journals. I am not sure why I began this evening in particular rather than any other evening. I think I was ready. October the 7th. I have found things I had not expected to find. Primarily myself, paying more attention than I knew. She stopped at this entry. It was the entry she had written the week she began. The evening after reading the first journal, the entry she had made while the tea was still warm and the first journal was still vivid. Reading it now, from 6 weeks' distance, she found it was accurate. She had found herself paying more attention than she knew. She had found, in the accumulation of 40 years of journals, the evidence for a life that had been larger than she had remembered it, more present, more effective, not in the grand sense, not in any sense that would figure in a history or a register, but in the Eliot sense, the unhistoric kind. She turned to the last entry she had written. It was from 2 days ago, November the 13th, 1888. 4 more journals to read. The house is nearly packed. I find, entirely well. She closed the journal. Entirely well. It was the truest thing she had written in 40 years. She opened the last journal again. She had read it to the last entry she had written, November the 13th. But there were still blank pages after it. 13 of them, she counted, fanning through the remaining pages. Room enough for 13 more entries, if she wrote in her usual measure. She would not need 13 entries. She was leaving in 4 days. She picked up her pen. She was not sure, beginning to write, what she intended to say, only that she intended to say something, that the habit of 40 years required that this ending not be silent. The journals had recorded the life. The life deserved an acknowledgement. She wrote for perhaps 20 minutes. When she finished, she read what she had written. November the 14th, 1888. I have spent the last 6 weeks reading 40 years of my own life, and I have found it, on balance, good. Not without failure, not without the particular list of things I would have done differently, which I have carried for so long that it has become familiar and almost comfortable, the way a scar becomes comfortable. The failures are real, and I do not intend to dismiss them. But the other ledger, the one I kept imperfectly and incompletely, the other ledger is also real, and it is larger than I remembered. I have taught, over 40 years, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 children. I do not know what most of them have become. I know what some of them have become: a journalist, a doctor, a teacher in Rutland, an engineer in Sheffield, others whose paths I do not know. I know that some of them were told at a moment when it mattered, that they were worth looking at. I know that some of them received a stew in the winter that was not called a stew. I know that some of them had someone present on the other side of the fire, attending. The world is not improved by great acts alone. George Eliot understood this. I have understood it theoretically for 40 years. I understand it now in the full weight of evidence. I am leaving Ash House with what I came with: my attention, my capacity for work, and the knowledge that the ordinary faithfully lived is not a smaller thing than the extraordinary. It is the same thing. It is, perhaps, the only thing. DM. She set the pen down. She closed the journal for the last time. Outside, it had begun to rain. She did not sleep particularly well. This was, she thought, acceptable under the circumstances. Tomorrow, she was leaving a house she had lived in for 31 years. And it seemed reasonable. It seemed, actually, correct, that the night before such a leaving should not be entirely peaceful. Peace, she had come to understand over 62 years, was not the absence of feeling, but the ability to hold feeling without being overwhelmed by it. She was holding quite a lot of feeling tonight, and she was holding it fine. She came downstairs at midnight and built the fire up in the nearly empty sitting room, the mantelpiece stripped, the shelves bare, the furniture covered or removed, the Persian rug still on the floor, because she was taking it to Bath, and it could not be packed until morning. She did not read. The journals were packed, all 41 of them in a wooden crate, the completed ones, and the last thin one with her November entries, waiting by the door with the rest of the boxes going to Bath. She sat in her chair, which was also waiting by the door to be collected tomorrow morning, and which she had pulled back to its position by the fire for tonight and tonight only. And she looked at the bare room. The room was a room. It was stone and plaster and timber, 31 years of her living in it. She had changed within it, and it had remained the same, and this was as it should be. The room's business was to be a room, and it had been an excellent room, and tomorrow someone else would live in it, and it would be an excellent room for them. She thought about the tulip bulbs in the garden. She thought about the journals in the crate. She thought about Jane Middleton in Rutland teaching a classroom of children, with what Dorothea had passed on to her. She thought about Ellen Hargreave Price's monograph in the box going to Bath. She thought, there are so many ways to continue. The fire burned. The town was very quiet. At 2 o'clock, she went back to bed and slept until 6. She wrote to her sister in Bath on the morning of departure. Not a last letter. She would be there in 3 days. But she had a habit, formed over 40 years, of writing down what she intended to say before she said it, and she found that she wanted to have said it in writing before she arrived. Dear Margaret, I am writing from the kitchen table for the last time, which is a fact I have noticed, and am recording in my usual manner. I will be with you on Friday. I have the books, the journals, the botanical notebooks, the rug, my chair, and the china. Everything I need is coming with me. I want to tell you something before I arrive. I have spent this month reading 40 years of my own journals, which I had not previously done, and which I commend to you as an enterprise if you are ever in a position to do it, though you have always been more naturally at peace with your past than I have, and so it may be less necessary. What I have found reading 40 years of my own life, that I paid considerably more attention than I knew, and that the attention had effect, not large effect, the kind of effect that is not recorded anywhere except in the people who carry it. I have spent a great deal of my life believing that a modest life is a smaller life. I no longer believe this. I believe that the quality of attention one brings to a life determines its size, not the life's external circumstances. I have brought a great deal of attention. I believe I have had a large life. I will arrive Friday on the 3 o'clock coach. Your loving sister, Dorothea. She sealed the letter, addressed it to Margaret Vane, Beaumont Street, Bath. She placed it on the table beside the door, to be posted from the first town they stopped at on the journey. She picked up her coat and her bag. She was ready. She gave herself one final hour. She had arranged for the carter to collect the furniture at 8 o'clock and the boxes at 9, and she had been awake since 5 and ready since 7, and between the two she had found that she had an hour that was only hers, and she took it and went out. November in Ramsby at 7 in the morning. Dark grey sky. Cold. The smell of coal smoke beginning as the town built its morning fires. The market square empty except for the pigeons on the market cross, and a dog moving with purpose across the cobblestones toward a destination it knew. The baker's on the far side was already lit, the smell of fresh bread reaching the cold air outside. Mr. Hargreaves' son now ran it. The father had retired in 1882. The son's bread was nearly as good. She walked Church Street from one end to the other, and turned and walked it back. She walked past the church, whose Norman tower she had been looking at from various angles for 40 years. She had attended services in it for 15 years, and then stopped attending services, but continued to find the building beautiful, which seemed to her a reasonable position. She walked down the lane to the river and stood at the edge and looked at it. The Nen in November, grey and full and moving with the quiet purposefulness of all rivers, which always know where they are going. She had written about this river dozens of times in the journals, in all its seasons, at all its levels. She had come here when she needed to think. She had come here after Thomas died, in the first weeks, when she needed the company of something that would not say anything. "It keeps going," she had written in the 1879 journal. "It is not comforting, exactly, but it is true, and truth has its own form of comfort." She stood at the river's edge for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she turned and walked back to Ash House for the last time. The carter was already in the lane. The coach left Ramsby at 10:30. She had a window seat, which she had requested and been given, and she sat in it with her travelling bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap and watched the town disappear. It disappeared quite quickly. There was the market square, and then there was the road and the flat Lincolnshire fields on either side, and the sky above them, which was grey, but not entirely grey. There was, at the horizon to the south, the pale watercolour wash of a winter sun trying to establish itself. She watched it trying. The coach was not full. A young man with a great deal of luggage was attempting to manage it across from her. A woman of perhaps 40 was reading a novel. A child of about 6 was sleeping with complete dedication against its mother's arm. Dorothea looked at the child sleeping and thought about the first journal. October the 5th, 1848. My name is Dorothea Hartley, and I am 22 years old. She thought about Ada Cropper, who had left the school and gone to the draper's and arranged a small library for herself in the back room. She thought about the dried violet in the back of the 1870 journal, which was now in a crate heading to Bath. She thought about Ellen Hargreave Price's monograph in the box marked Bath Books, Urgent. She thought about the tulip bulbs in the garden, burgundy red by April, for someone else. She thought about Jane Middleton in Rutland, teaching a classroom of children with what had been passed on. She thought about Thomas, who had preferred Dickens and had been right about almost everything else. She thought, I am 62 years old and I am going somewhere, not away from, toward. The winter sun at the horizon strengthened slightly, not warming, not this time of year, but present, clear, doing what the winter sun does, illuminating without changing the temperature. She had always thought there was something honest about winter sun. It gave you the light without false promises about warmth. It showed you the landscape as it was. She settled in her seat. The coach went on, south and west, toward Bath. She had the materials for an excellent decade. She opened her eyes wider to take in more of the road ahead. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life. George Eliot, Middlemarch, 1872.